What happens when the sea, an old and hungry god, rises up to claim everything a man has ever known? For one fisherman, a man whose heart was already an empty vessel, it began not with a prayer, but with a bitter laugh aimed at a wooden statue, and it ended with a miracle that no one, least of all him, could ever explain. This is the story of how a wave meant to destroy everything brought one man, and his entire village, back to life. Kale was a man made of salt and sorrow. He lived in Porto Cais, a village that clung to its rocky coast like a stubborn barnacle. His house, weathered to the color of driftwood, stood closest to the shore, a testament to a defiance he no longer felt, only endured. The sea had given him his life as a fisherman, and then it had taken the life from him, swallowing his wife, Lena, and their little girl, Maya, in a squall that had appeared from a clear sky 6 years prior. Since that day, Kale had become an island. He spoke to no one unless necessary, his words as clipped and sharp as broken shells. He worked his nets with a methodical fury, pulling a living from the very entity he hated, his face a permanent mask of grim resolve. The other villagers gave him a wide berth. They saw the ghost of grief that walked with him, a shadow deeper than any cast by the afternoon sun. Porto Cais itself was a place of quiet faith and loud superstition. The people lived by the tides and prayed to a pantheon of saints, but their most fervent devotion was reserved for a single, humble figure. In the tiny chapel that overlooked the harbor, perched on the highest cliff, stood a statue of the Virgin Mary. It was carved from a single piece of cedar over a century ago by the great-grandfather of Alara, the village matriarch. They called her the Star of the Sea. She was not a masterpiece of art. Her face was simple, her painted blue mantle chipped by decades of salty air, her hands clasped in a prayer that seemed both serene and weary. But to the people of Porto Cais, she was everything. They left her offerings of wildflowers and polished stones. Before setting out each morning, the fishermen would cross themselves in her direction, a silent plea for safe return. Kale remembered Lena doing just that. He remembered her small hand making the sign, her lips moving in a silent prayer for his safety. Now, the memory was acid. He looked at the statue and saw only a block of wood, a hollow idol for hollow hopes. Faith was a luxury for those who had not seen the true, merciless face of the ocean. The warning came on a Tuesday. The sky was an unnerving shade of yellow-gray, and the air was thick and still, carrying a strange metallic scent. A government radio broadcast crackled through the village, speaking of a tremor deep beneath the ocean floor, hundreds of miles away. It spoke of a wave, a wall of water moving with impossible speed. It spoke the word tsunami. Panic bloomed like a toxic algae. The villagers, whose lives were dictated by the moods of the sea, understood the threat instantly. They began a frantic exodus, grabbing children, essential papers, and whatever small heirlooms they could carry, their faces pale with a terror passed down through generations. They moved as one body toward the high ground, the inland hills that rose steeply behind the village. Kale did not move. He sat on his porch, mending a net with slow, deliberate fingers, as if it were just another Tuesday. He watched the chaos, the fear in his neighbor's eyes, and felt nothing but a cold, quiet emptiness. He had already lost everything that mattered. What was a house? What was a boat? They were just things. The sea could have them. It could have him, too. Alara, her face a web of deep lines, her back bent with age but not weakness, found him there. Her grandson, a small boy named Leo, clung to her skirt, his eyes wide with fear. "Kale," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "You must come. Now." He did not look up from his net. "I am staying. This is not a storm, Kale. It is a beast. It will leave nothing behind." He finally raised his eyes. They were hollow, devoid of light. "It already left nothing behind," he answered, his voice flat. Desperation tightened Alara's face. She looked toward the empty chapel on the cliff. "Then for the love of God, go and get her. Take the Star of the Sea with you. She has protected this village for 100 years. A sound rumbled in Kale's chest, a dry, grating noise that was almost a laugh. The sound of a rusted hinge being forced open. "A piece of wood," he scoffed, the bitterness of 6 years pouring into the words. "Your statue didn't save my Lena. It didn't save my Maya. Wood doesn't stop water, Alara." The old woman flinched as if he had struck her. She looked at him with a profound sadness, a sorrow that was not for the coming wave, but for the shipwreck of his soul. "You mock what you do not understand," she whispered. Then she took Leo's hand and turned away, joining the stream of refugees hurrying toward the hills. Kale watched them go until the last person had disappeared over the rise. The village was silent. The only sounds were the crying of the gulls and the distant, mournful wail of an emergency siren. He was completely, utterly alone. He had wanted this isolation for 6 years, and now he had it. He waited for the sea. Then, an impossible quiet fell. The birds went silent. The wind died. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Kale stood and walked to the edge of the shore. What he saw made the hair on his arms stand up. The sea was pulling back, not like a normal tide, but like a vast sheet being drawn away from the land, exposing yards, then hundreds of yards of wet, glistening seabed. Starfish and crabs writhed in the suddenly dry sand. A forgotten anchor, caked in rust and coral, lay exposed like an ancient skeleton. This was wrong. This was unnatural. For the first time, a sliver of primal fear pierced the thick calluses around his heart. This was the sea he knew, the one from his nightmares. The patient, predatory sea that gathered its strength before it struck. His defiance began to feel thin and foolish, a child's bravado in the face of a leviathan. He was small. He was nothing. His gaze lifted, drawn by instinct to the chapel on the cliff. And in its small, arched window, he saw it. Or thought he saw it. A flicker of soft, blue light. It pulsed once, gently, like a distant star, before vanishing. He blinked, shaking his head. A trick of the light. The strange atmosphere playing with his eyes. It had to be. Statues did not glow. He turned back to the horizon. It was there. A thin white line, almost imperceptible at first, but growing. It was not a wave. It was a moving cliff face, a liquid mountain rising from the deep, consuming the horizon as it came. The sound began then, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of his feet, growing into a deep, terrifying roar that was not of this world. The beast had come. There was no time to run, no time to think. There was only time to stare as the world he knew was about to be erased. The wave hit the outer reef with the force of an artillery barrage, throwing a spray of white water hundreds of feet into the air. It towered over the cliffs, blotting out the yellow-gray sky. Kale watched the wall of water crash down upon the small chapel, watched the simple stone structure disintegrate into dust and splinters in less than a heartbeat. Then it was his turn. The water struck his house not as a liquid, but as a solid, grinding force. Wood exploded. Glass shattered. The roar was absolute, a sound that swallowed all other sounds. Kale was lifted and thrown, his body a rag doll in the grip of a furious giant. He was underwater, tumbling in a black, churning vortex of sand, wood, and unrecognizable debris. His lungs burned for air. Pain flared in his shoulder, his leg, his head. He fought against the current, but it was like fighting a mountain. There was no up, no down, only the violent, suffocating chaos. This was it, he thought, a strange calm settling over him. This was the end the sea had promised him. He would join Lena and Maya in the cold, dark deep. As his strength gave out, as the blackness began to creep into the edges of his vision, something changed. The violent tumbling ceased. The deafening roar receded to a distant rumble. He felt held. It was not a physical sensation, but a spiritual one. He was floating in a pocket of impossible stillness, sheltered from the maelstrom that raged just beyond his perception. A sense of peace, so profound and so alien, washed over him, deeper than any ocean. It was a mother's love, a feeling he had not known since he was a small boy. A gentle pressure, like a soft hand, rested on his forehead, and though no words were spoken, a message bloomed in his mind, clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. It was a feeling of immense, sorrowful love, a love that acknowledged his pain, his bitterness, his brokenness, and accepted it all without judgment. He felt the phantom presence of his wife, the memory of his daughter's laugh, the boundless love of a mother for her lost son. The scent of salt and death was gone, replaced for a single, impossible moment by the sweet, clean fragrance of roses. You are not alone. The presence communicated, not in words, but in pure understanding. My son waits for you, but not yet. It was a promise, a reprieve, forgiveness. He didn't understand it. He only knew that in the heart of the world's rage, he had been shown a mercy he did not deserve. He let go of his struggle, let go of his hate, and surrendered to the deep, peaceful dark. Air. Cold, sharp, life-giving air. Kale's eyes flew open as his body convulsed, coughing up a lungful of salt water. He was lying on his back, tangled in a mess of seaweed and splintered wood. Above him, the clouds were beginning to break, and a weak, watery sunlight shone down on a landscape of total devastation. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. He was on a muddy slope, miles from where Port Oakais had once stood. The world was a ruin. The sea, now calm and gray, lapped gently at a new shoreline littered with the guts of his village. Trees were stripped bare. Houses were gone. There was nothing but mud and wreckage as far as he could see. He was alive. The thought was not triumphant, but baffling. He should be dead. He had felt himself dying. He looked down at his hands. They were scraped and bleeding. In his right hand, he was clutching something so tightly his knuckles were white. It was a piece of wood, curved and smooth on one side, splintered on the other. He didn't remember grabbing it. He didn't remember anything after the piece. The rage that had been his constant companion for 6 years was gone. The bitterness had been scoured out of him. In its place was a vast, trembling emptiness, but it was not the emptiness of loss. It was the emptiness of a vessel waiting to be filled. It was awe. It was terror. It was the beginning of something he could not name. He got to his feet, his body a constellation of pain, and began to walk. He did not limp toward the ruins of his own home. He did not look for his boat. His eyes were fixed on the cliff where the chapel had been. He stumbled through the mud and debris, a man on a pilgrimage through his own desolation. When he reached the cliff, his breath caught in his throat. It was gone. Everything was gone. The chapel, the stone walls, the pews, the altar, all of it had been swept clean, scoured from the rock. All that remained was the foundation, a flat rectangle of stone that now looked out over a placid, indifferent sea. He had seen it destroyed. He had watched the wave obliterate it. And yet, standing there, seeing the proof of its absence, a grief unlike any he had ever known washed over him. It was not for the building. It was for his own blindness, for his mockery, for the grace he had pushed away. Cale fell to his knees on the cold, wet stone of the foundation. He lowered his head until his forehead touched the rock, and for the first time since he had buried his family, he wept. He cried for his wife and daughter. He cried for his lost years. He cried for the hollow man he had been. He cried until there were no tears left, only the shuddering gasps of a soul laid bare. Slowly, cautiously, the survivors began to return. They came down from the hills in small, dazed groups, their faces etched with shock and despair. They looked upon the utter destruction of their village, and a collective moan of grief rose into the air. Boats were smashed to kindling. Homes were reduced to foundations. Their lives, their history, had been wiped away. Alara stood with her small group, her face grim but her eyes searching. They were all accounted for. Everyone who had made it to the hills was safe. But their world was gone. Hope was a fragile thing, easily drowned. Then, Leo, her grandson, let out a small cry. He pointed a trembling finger toward the beach. "Grandma, look." Alara followed his gaze, and her breath stopped. There, on the wide expanse of debris-strewn sand, was a single, upright figure. It stood perfectly vertical, lodged in the wet sand as if it had been placed there by a careful hand. It was surrounded by a tangled chaos of splintered boats, fishing nets, and the broken pieces of their lives, yet it was untouched. It was the star of the sea. Her painted blue mantle was still bright. Her serene, carved face was unmarred. Her hands were still clasped in prayer. She had been in the chapel that Cale had watched get annihilated. She should have been smashed into 1,000 pieces, swept miles out to sea. Yet here she was, whole, perfect, waiting for them. A hush fell over the villagers. They moved as one, drawn by an invisible force, walking slowly across the beach until they formed a wide, silent circle around the statue. They stared, unable to process what they were seeing. It was impossible. It was a miracle. Into this stunned silence, a figure came limping. Cale, covered in mud and blood, his clothes torn, looked like a ghost who had clawed his way out of a grave. Whispers broke out as he approached. They saw the man who had stayed behind, the man who had mocked their faith. They expected bitterness, or worse, a vacant madness. Kale did not look at them. His eyes were fixed only on the statue. He walked through the circle of people, his gaze filled with a reverence that stunned them into silence. He stopped before the wooden figure, his face working with emotions they had never seen on him before. Regret. Awe. Gratitude. Then he did something that broke the heart of every person watching. He slowly, painfully, lowered himself to his knees in the wet sand. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch the statue itself, but to gently brush a speck of mud from its base. He remained there, kneeling, his head bowed, a silent testament to a transformation no one could comprehend. Seeing Kale, their most hardened and broken skeptic, kneeling in humble supplication before the statue was a greater miracle than its survival. It was a sign that something more than a village had been saved from the flood. A soul had been brought back from the deep. Alara walked forward and placed a gentle hand on his shaking shoulder. Around them, one by one, other villagers knelt in the sand, their despair beginning to recede, replaced by the first, fragile tide of hope. In the weeks and months that followed, Kale was a changed man. The silence he had once worn as armor became a quiet strength. He spoke little of what happened to him in the water, but he didn't have to. His actions preached a sermon more powerful than any words. He became the heart of the rebuilding, his untiring energy a source of constant inspiration. He was the first to begin clearing debris and the last to stop working each day. He salvaged wood to help a neighbor rebuild a wall. He dove into the murky harbor to retrieve tools and untangle lines. The man who had been an island now became a bridge, connecting his neighbors with quiet acts of service, his hands rebuilding the community he had once renounced. His grief had not vanished, but it no longer owned him. It had been transformed into a wellspring of compassion. They did not rebuild the chapel on the cliff. Its empty foundation became a memorial, a place for quiet reflection on what was lost. Instead, they built a new, open-air shrine in the very center of the newly laid-out village. They built it together, with salvaged wood and stone pulled from the ruins. At its center, they placed the Star of the Sea. She no longer stood apart from them on a lonely cliff, but was now in the heart of their daily lives. She stood not as a talisman against disaster, but as a permanent reminder. A reminder that even in the face of total destruction, grace could survive. A reminder that faith was not about avoiding storms, but about finding the strength to rebuild after they pass. Kale often found himself sitting on the simple wooden bench before the shrine in the quiet evenings. He did not pray with words. He did not ask for anything. He simply sat in her presence, the fisherman and the Star of the Sea, feeling the quiet peace that had found him in the heart of the storm. The sea had taken everything from him, and then, in its own mysterious way, it had given him back his soul, washed clean upon the shore. He was no longer a man lost at sea, but a man who had, at long last, been brought safely home. The story of Porto Cais and its miraculous statue teaches us that hope can be found in the most desolate of places. It shows that even when our world is washed away, something essential can endure, and that a heart can be rebuilt, stronger and more compassionate than before. If this story of survival and faith has moved you, please take a moment to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Like this video and subscribe for more stories that warm the soul. And please, share this message of hope with someone you know who might be weathering their own storm.